Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my...
Okay, good evening. It is time for the next part of the Occult A History. And I didn't realize, because we haven't read in a while, in this book in a while. I haven't read in this book in a while. We were right in the middle of a chapter. It was one of those really long chapters I had to stop in the middle of. So we'll be finishing up that chapter tonight. I think it's, if I remember right now, it's roughly 25 pages. Come on. There we go. And are we back in focus? Okay. All right. So I'm just going to jump straight on into it. I'm sure we'll remember what was being talked about as we go along. All right. So I will just start here. I'm not sure where I was on the page, but this looks like as good a place as any. If the 15th century is the century of magic, the 18th is the least magical of all. Magic reached its lowest point, and its three most noted practitioners, Cagliostro, Saint Germain, and Casanova, were adventurers rather than occultists. To include Casanova among the magicians may cause surprise, but he was in fact a serious student of the Kabbalah and astrology. And although he thought of himself as an impostor, his powers of prophecy often surprised and worried him. His memoirs, besides being the world's greatest autobiography and the most complete picture of Europe in the 18th century, are also the best possible introduction to the forms taken by occultism in the quote-unquote Age of Reason. Giovanni Jacopo Casanova, who later added the spurious title Chevalier de Siengalte, was born in Venice in April 1725, son of an actor of Spanish descent and the beautiful daughter of a shoemaker with whom he eloped. Young Giovanni was so sickly that he was not expected to live. A nosebleed continued so long that he was taken by his grandmother to a witch, who locked him in a box while she performed noisy incantations. The bleeding stopped. The witch burned drugs, gathered the smoke in a sheet, and wrapped it around him. Finally, she told him that a beautiful lady would visit him that night. In the night, Casanova saw a beautiful fairy come out of the fireplace into his room. Fire grates were large in those days, and rubbed ointment on his head, speaking in a foreign language. His symptoms vanished during the next month, and he became a healthy and precocious boy. Before we dismiss this story as evidence of Casanova's fecund, I've never known how to pronounce that, imagination, it is worth bearing in mind that, like Cellini, he often sounds less truthful than he actually is. Where it has been possible to check his stories against other sources, they have proved to be remarkably accurate. The witch was probably genuine, even if the fairy was a dream resulting from her suggestion. In his teens, Casanova became an abbé, but his enthusiasm for the opposite sex was his downfall. He was thrown out of the house of his patron, a senator, when he was caught with the senator's ward, looking into the difference in conformation between a boy and a girl, quote unquote. After more similar indiscretions, he left the church for the army, then became a fiddler in a theater and joined a band of daredevils who spent their nights looking for trouble. One evening he made the acquaintance of a senator named Bragadin, who suffered an apoplectic fit on the way home in a gondola. Casanova installed himself as a nurse. When the senator's two closest friends told Casanova he might go home if he wanted to, Casanova replied, with his naturally theatrical instinct, quote, "If I go, he will die. If I stay, he will get well." End quote. Strangely enough, the prophecy proved accurate. In the night, Bragadin almost succumbed to a mercury poultice that his physician had put on his chest. Casanova removed it and washed his chest, whereupon the invalid fell into a peaceful slumber. The following day, the doctor resigned the case and left his patient in the charge of Casanova, who proceeded to quote medical authorities he had never read and prescribed the correct treatment, rest and diet, by instinct. Then came the fateful day. M. Is it going to be Mr. Macer? I don't know. Anyway, M. de Bragadin, who had the weakness to believe in the occult sciences, told me one day that for a young man of my age, he thought my learning too extensive, and that he was certain I was the possessor of some supernatural endowment. Casanova, never one to fly in the face of Providence, admitted that he was a Kabbalist and possessed the key of Solomon. He found them easy to deceive. They asked him the incomprehensible questions, and his oracle gave incomprehensible answers, which they professed to find enlightening. Quote, I saw how easy it must have been for the ancient heathen priests to impose upon ignorant and therefore credulous mankind. End quote. He was given a generous allowance and treated like a son of the house. He took to gambling, his chief source of income throughout his life, and soon after engaged in his first major deception as a magician. The motive seems to have been pure vanity and the spirit of mischief. In Mantua, a young man persuaded him to go and look at the collection of antiquities owned by his father, among which was a knife said to be the one with which St. Peter cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Luke states that it is a sword. Casanova, amused by the credulous old gentleman, assured him that he was possessed of a fortune, since the knife had magical powers. It could be used to locate all the buried treasure in the Pope's dominions. However, its sheath was also needed, and fortunately Casanova knew the man who owned the sheath. He manufactured a sheath out of an old boot, which he showed to the antiquarian. He now offered himself as the magician who could unearth the treasure for them. The son had a letter from a man who thought there was treasure on his land, which was part of part of the papal estates. As he brought out the letter, Casanova managed to glimpse the name of the village, Cesena. Or is that Cesena? Cesena. He set up his oracle numbered boards made into numbered cards made into pyramids, and extracted the answer that the treasure in question was buried somewhere near the Rubicon. A map was consulted, and it was found that the Rubicon ran through Cesena. The old man and his son admitted the identity of the village, totally convinced they were dealing with a magician. In Cesena, Casanova was introduced into the household of a wealthy peasant, George Franzia. The eldest daughter, a girl of 14 named Javotte, Javotte, was pretty, which was what Casanova had hoped. An adventure without a sexual involvement would not have been to his taste. He was a master in the art of obtaining confidence by various means. He told the old man that they must observe strict secrecy for fear of the Inquisition. When he asked why it was that the inquisitors were more powerful than a magician, Casanova explained that it was because monks had more devils under their command. He told them that Javotte would be their means of obtaining the treasure because a pure virgin was necessary. Then, on successive days, he instituted a ritual bathing of members of the family, first the father, then the brother, and then, the whole point of the proceeding, Javotte. He explains that he did not expect to make her fall in love with him, quote, but one finds a compensation in the complete control obtained over a woman, end quote. He bathed her himself, and she responded to his caresses until, quote, her ardent fire was at last quenched by the natural result of that excitement, end quote. On drying her, Casanova came close to destroying the virginity that was essential to his magic, but fortunately his own excitement also reached a harmless climax before he succumbed. The following morning it was the girl's turn to bathe him, and she proved an expert at caresses as Casanova himself. She slept in his room, and from that night onward they slept together, although he continued to, quote, respect the essential point, end quote. He decided that her virginity could remain intact until the night after the incantations. He mentions passing a part of the following night observing some of the strange signs that had made Franzia certain the treasure was buried on his land. Heavy blows came from under the ground at intervals, and the cellar door opened and closed regularly, as if by invisible hands. He admits that he was unable to explain this, but concludes that, quote, there was some unknown roguery at work, end quote. When the hour came, he says, quote, I throw off all profane garments. I clothe myself in the long white robe, the work of a virgin's innocent hands. I allow my long hair to fall loosely. I place the extraordinary crown on my head, the circle maximus on my shoulders, and seizing seizing the scepter with one hand, the wonderful knife with the other, I go down into the yard. Then I spread my circle on the ground, uttering the most barbarous words, and after going round it 3 times, I jump into the middle. End quote. A thunderstorm began to brew up, and Casanova experienced a fleeting regret that he had not thought of predicting that something of the sort might take place. But as the sky was split with lightning, he suddenly began to wonder if there wasn't something supernatural going on after all. And as the storm increased, he became convinced that if he was to escape with his life, he must remain in the magic circle. The amusing consequence is that Casanova ended by being convinced that the innocence of the Virgin was under the special protection of God, and that if he dared to violate it, quote, the most rapid and terrible death would be my punishment, end quote. And so he explained to Franzia that the 7 spirits guarding the treasure had made him agree to delay digging it up, and gave him a long document describing the location and extent of the treasure. It is typical of Casanova that he later returned to present Javotte with a pair of expensive bracelets. In spite of his rogueries, he was fundamentally a good man. There would be no point in relating his other exploits as a quote-unquote magician. The ancient and gullible Madame de Durfey believed in him implicitly, and he explains typically that, quote, if I had thought it possible to lead back Madame Durfey to the right use of her senses, I would have made the attempt, but I felt sure her disease was without remedy, and the only course before me seemed to abet her in her ravings and profit by them, end quote. He accordingly took part in remarkable ceremonies whose aim was to cause Madame Durfey's soul to pass into the body of a baby, so she could live all over again. The passage describing the ceremony is inimitably funny, and affords some insight into the kind of charlatanism employed by other magicians besides Casanova, but it is too long to quote here. On falling in love with a beautiful Englishwoman, Justiniana Wynne, whom he calls Mademoiselle XCV, he made use of the name of Paracelsus to produce the desired result. She was pregnant by a lover who had deserted her, and told Casanova that she had a recipe for an aroph, AROPH, and it's in quotes, that would terminate her condition. It was quote a kind of unguent composed of several drugs such as saffron, myrrh, etc., compounded with virgin honey, end quote. Casanova, whose advances had already been rejected, immediately added that the preparation became infallible if it was mixed with fresh male semen, and offering himself as the means of introducing the aroph into the mouth of the womb. Quote, we looked, I like a medical student about to perform an operation, and she like a book about a confidence man. What? Am I skipping a page there? No. Oh, I am. There are 2 pages that were not coming apart. Okay, she like a patient. That makes more sense. With this difference that it was the patient who arranged the dressing. When she was ready, that is, when she had placed the aroph as neatly as a skull cap fits a parson, she put herself in the proper position for the preparation to mix with the semen, end quote. It is sad to relate that, in spite of dozens of applications of the aroph to the mouth of the womb, Paracelsus's recipe failed, and Mrs. Wynne eventually had the baby in a covenant. Wonder why that was. Casanova possessed a natural occult faculty. When some of his absurder prophecies came true, he would experience for a moment the superstitious awe he felt in the thunderstorm. Once, when he made a careless slip in consulting the Pyramid Oracle, the answer obtained struck him as utterly wild, but it proved to be correct. In Dux, D-U-X, where he spent his declining years, he stated that a certain cat would have 6 black kittens, and the cat had precisely that number. His occult faculty accounted for his amazing luck during his first 40 years. A sixth sense made him say or do the right thing, as when he found himself announcing that if he stayed with Bragadin, he would live. The same thing applies to his relations with women. If the memoirs were a novel, it would explain why there is an odd similarity about his sexual exploits. The author would be recording his own fantasies. Some commentators have questioned Casanova's veracity on precisely these grounds, that the same type of girl, the same type of situation keep recurring. For readers with more insight and sympathy, this is precisely what assures his basic veracity. In real life, the same type of thing does keep happening to people with a definite personality. Casanova, with his punctilious good manners and his genuine protectiveness and generosity toward women, was always meeting a type of impressionable girl who, within days or even hours, was saying, quote, "Do what you like with me, I am yours," end quote. It is typical that his own daughter fell in love with him without, of course, knowing his identity. Hello, Paxtonet, current master's student at Harvard, doing a thesis on the decline of Gnosticism and the rise of the Orthodoxy. Do I have thoughts on that? Actually, I don't. Not because I don't want to answer, but because I have not studied the Gnostics nearly as much as I'd like to. They're on my list, and that will be coming up in reading for this stream, but I really don't have enough information on them to form an opinion. So, sorry. But thank you for asking. Yeah, let's keep going with the reading here. This curious psychic radar began to fail him in his late 30s, when his passion for a beautiful courtesan, La Charpillon, led him to commit various follies, none of which brought him any closer to his goal. She was one of his few total failures. She set out to humiliate him and succeeded. The superb confidence that had for years brought him the luck of a sleepwalker was cracked. And from now on, although he still had his triumphs ahead of him, he was on the downhill slope of defeat. It is interesting to reflect that precisely the same thing happened to Mesmer during his later Paris period. The confidence went, and what is a mesmerist without confidence? Casanova lived to be 73, dying 2 years before the end of the century he had dramatized so brilliantly. But something of the essential Casanova died in London with his passion for La Charpillon. Sorry, I have a little bit of trouble with the French pronunciations. In the long drawn-out frustration of his last days, Casanova kept his soul alive by writing his memoirs. But when Count Marcolini at Dresden refused to allow even the first volume to be printed, he lost heart and broke off the writing at the point where he had reached his 50th year. How great is the loss may be a matter of some dispute, for the remaining years of his life might have left the reader with a bitter taste in his mouth. But there is one cause of regret for all students of the occult, that Casanova did not describe his second meeting with one of the most baffling men of the age, the Count Cagliostro. He might have cleared up a mystery that must now remain unsolved. Everyone has heard the name of Cagliostro. For most people, It was sinister and dubious. Sorry, I don't know why I'm stumbling so much tonight. For most people, it has sinister and dubious associations, rather like that of Rasputin. Few people, even among the well-informed, knew very much about him, for even the basic facts of his life are in doubt. The only thing we know with any certainty is that he died tragically in the prisons of the Inquisition in 1795, probably strangled by his jailer. Opinions as to his powers and abilities cover the whole spectrum, from Carlyle's King of Liars and Great Quackface to Lewis Spence's one of the great occult figures of all time, quote unquote. Even his identity is still a matter of argument. In her book on the diamond necklace affair, Frances Mossacker remarks, quote, those who consult the encyclopedias will find it stated as categorical fact that Count Alessandro de Cagliostro was Giuseppe Balsamo of Palermo, end quote. It is enough to shake one's faith in reference books, in view of the fact that the basis for such identification must rest for eternity on the evidence of an anonymous letter to the Paris police. But Miss Mossacker ends by more or less acknowledging that Cagliostro and Balsamo are probably the same person. W.R.H. Trowbridge denies it emphatically in his book on Cagliostro, asserting that although Casanova met Balsamo, whom he describes unflatteringly, he never met Cagliostro. F. Ribadeau Dumas, the author of Cagliostro, Scoundrel or Saint, has the highest possible opinion of Cagliostro, but accepts that he was Balsamo. Goethe, I know I mispronounced that, Goethe, Goethe, I know I mispronounce it, but I'll say it Goethe anyway, was sufficiently fascinated by Cagliostro to pay a visit to Balsamo's family when he was in Palermo. A full account of the visit can be found in Funk Brentano's Cagliostro and Company, but he portrays him as a swindler in his play The Grand Coft. But Goethe's interest in Cagliostro is the clue to the truth that probably lies behind all these contradictions. It was not, I think, the interest of the artist in the scoundrel, the interest that made Thomas Mann write a book about a confidence man. It was a recognition of a fundamental similarity between the two of them. Shaw remarked that no man is at home in society until he has found his natural place, either above or below, the one he is born to. Cagliostro and Goethe were both born far below their natural places. Both ended up hobnobbing with princes and cardinals and gaining universal respect on the strength of inborn genius. Oh, you know what I just now realized after pages and pages? I didn't start my captions. All I needed to do was press the button to start captioning. That's what I get for taking a break. Hobnobbing with cardinals. And there was a natural genius, a natural strength in Cagliostro that made itself felt. A hostile witness, the Baroness de Oberkirk, met him at Cardinal Rohan's at Saverne, and describes him, quote, while not actually handsome, his face was the most remarkable I have ever seen. His eyes, above all, were indescribable, with supernatural depths, all fire and yet all ice. It seems to me that if any two artists sketched him, the two portraits, while having some slight resemblance, might yet well be totally dissimilar. Ambivalent, he at once attracted and repelled you. He frightened you and at the same time inspired you with insurmountable curiosity. End quote. Casanova had described him about 10 years earlier as, quote, short and badly hung, and his face bore all the indications of daring, impudence, sarcasm, and imposture. End quote. But this sounds like hindsight sharpened by jealousy. Baroness de Oberkirk says, quote, Cagliostro was possessed of a demonic power. He enthralled the mind, paralyzed the will, end quote. This is no vulgar adventurer. It is a man of real force. When Cagliostro was in the hands of the Inquisition, his biography was written by one of his hirelings. Naturally, it portrays him simply as a scoundrel and cheat. Carlyle and all other hostile commentators have followed this Inquisition biography, whose avowed him of why am I stumbling so much? Whose avowed aim is to cut its subject down to size. The obvious question arises, if Cagliostro was such a contemptible rogue, how did he achieve such influence over so many people? Carlyle replies, because he was one of the greatest cheats that ever lived, and this crude and simplistic view simply denies the remarkable power to which so many people have testified. If it is accepted that Cagliostro was in his way a man of genius, that is, of an intelligent vitality far above the average, the contradictions begin to vanish, and the story of his life takes on a shape and direction that is absent from Casanova's. It is fairly certain that he was born Giuseppe Balsamo, son of a poor family of Palermo, in 1743. Goethe describes the family as simple but warm-hearted peasants living in a single room. His father died when he was young, and since his disposition was naturally explosive, he soon became ungovernable. He was sent to the seminary school of San Rocco, but ran away several times. He was then enrolled as a novice in the Benfratelli of Girone. Sorry. Sorry about the butchering those names. One day, in a burst of anti-clerical exuberance, he shocked the brothers by improvising freely on the sacred text he was supposed to be reading aloud at supper, substituting the names of notorious prostitutes for those of the saints. This achieved the effect he had been aiming for. He was thrown out. He now took lessons in drawing, for which he showed unusual talent. His skill with the pen and brush extended to copying letters, theater tickets, and anything else that would bring a profit. He was naturally attracted to the occult and to alchemy and astrology. It is not certain where he acquired his basic knowledge, but Sicily has always had a strong tradition of witchcraft and occultism, and no doubt instruction was easy to come by. He possessed a natural degree of second sight. This is evidenced by the story told by Baroness de Oberkirk, who describes how Cagliostro, immediately after seeing her for the first time, suddenly announced, quote, "You lost your mother a long time ago. You hardly remember her. You were an only child. You have one daughter, and she will be an only child. You will have no more children." End quote. Pressed to answer by Cardinal Rohan, the offended baroness, who objected to being addressed so familiarly, finally admitted that he was right about herself. His prediction about her daughter also came true. The stories of his rascalities in this period all stem from his Inquisition biographer and may therefore be suspect. The most famous of them states that he gained the confidence of a miserly goldsmith and convinced him that he could make gold. The incantations took place in a remote field at midnight, and at the crucial moment ruffians dressed as demons rushed out and knocked the goldsmith insensible. When he recovered his senses, Balsamo managed to convince him that the demons had made off with the large amount of gold they had brought with them for purposes of magical conjuration. The same source adds that Balsamo was himself robbed by two accomplices in Calabria and reached Rome at the age of 17, completely destitute. He managed to live by his artistic talents. Goethe tells a story of how Balsamo forged some documents at the request of the Sicilian marquis and was thrown into prison in consequence. The enraged marquis, or Marquis, went to see the judge and met the prosecuting counsel in his anteroom. He ended up by knocking him down and jumping on him. The judge was so impressed by his display of conviction that he freed Balsamo on the spot. It's an unusual legal strategy, I'd say. Whether the forgery story is true or not, it is certain that he continued to study occultism and became the laboratory assistant of a Greek named Altotas, who, among other things, had discovered a process for giving flax fibers the glossy feeling of silk. They traveled in Egypt and called at Malta, and where they made the acquaintance of the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, a man named Pinta. Pinta was an enthusiastic amateur of alchemy and welcomed the two adepts. Balsamo so impressed him that he later gave him letters of introduction to distinguished men in Rome and Naples. In Rome, as a dashing young artist of 26, Balsamo was fascinated by a beautiful 14-year-old girl. Why is there always after the 14-year-olds back then? Beautiful 14-year-old girl, daughter of a copper smelter, who lived in an alley named after the local church of the Trinita de Pellegrini in a slum quarter. Lorenza Feliciani was illiterate but dazzling, and in spite of some opposition from her father, she married Balsamo. Well, at least he married her and didn't just try to get with her. It was in the following year that Casanova met them at Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. He says that they were assumed to be people of rank because they had distributed alms generously on entering the town. They had made a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela in Italy, and then to Our Lady of Pilar in Spain, and were now going back to Rome. Lorenza, who impressed Casanova as modest, devoted, and honest, said that the alms they had given were the excess from the money they had received at the last town, where they had begged them. Balsamo asked Casanova to take up a collection for them at the table d'hôte, and Lorenza asked him to give them a letter of introduction for Avignon. Later, Balsamo proved his skill as a forger by making such an exact copy of the letter that Casanova himself swore that the copy was his original letter. He warned Balsamo to be careful, or his talent might cost him his life. From this story, it is clear that Balsamo had found a jewel in his wife. With her gentle beauty, she made a far more favorable impression than Balsamo could have created alone. Whether the pilgrimage was undertaken for religious reasons is a different matter. Balsamo was a man who had something inside him that wanted to get out. He could not have settled down to copper smelting in Rome. He felt the world held something important in store for him, and he meant to keep moving until he found it. They seem to have returned to Spain, for Lorenza later recounted how the viceroy in Barcelona tried to seduce her, and then, when she repulsed him, tried to get her arrested as an unmarried woman living in sin. In Madrid, Balsamo worked for the Duke of Alva. In the following year they came to London, and Balsamo worked as a painter and decorator for a while with a fellow Italian. And there is a story that he extorted £100 from a Quaker who fell in love with his wife and was caught by him in a compromising position. It is certain that he went to prison for debt, having failed in a lawsuit against someone who owed him for pen drawings. Lorenzo persuaded a philanthropist named Sir Edward Hales, whom she later called Sir de Hales, to get her husband out of jail. He did more than this. He gave Balsamo a job decorating the ceiling at his home near Canterbury. Balsamo was not used to this kind of work, and when the ceiling was ruined, they left for France. Lorenzo describes an acquaintance they made on the boat. Quote, "On the passage to France, we made the acquaintance of Mr. Duplessis, the steward of the Marquis de Prie, who showed us all kind of civilities. And when Mr. Balsamo showed him some of his works, he appeared surprised. Quote, "You will make your fortune in Paris," he said. "I am an advocate at the Parliament, and I know many lords. Don't distress yourself. I'll present you to the king. You won't have to go on your travels again. Your wife is very pleasant, very pretty, very charming. I'll do all I can to set you up in Paris." End quote. Balsamo must have guessed that Duplessis was more interested in Lorenza than himself, but the prospect of finally settling down to a prosperous existence no doubt made him prefer to ignore the danger and hope for the best. They were destitute when they arrived at Calais, but Mr. Duplessis, or Monsieur Duplessis, I assume is what it should be, offered Lorenza a seat in his carriage. Quote, "And what of my husband?" End quote. She said, quote, "Can't he wait a little at Calais? He will come on later." End quote. She declined, so Duplessis offered Balsamo the use of a horse. The long ride to Paris must have been hard on his seat. Meanwhile, Monsieur Duplessis was whispering declarations of love in Lorenza's ear. Quote, "Thus tormented against my will, I was several times tempted to stop and leave Monsieur Duplessis in order to escape the solicitations and actual violence he showed me. But knowing the irritable and fiery nature of my husband, I feared to inform him of what was going on." End quote. In Paris, Monsieur Duplessis let them stay at the house of the Marquis de Prie. Balsamo was naturally more tired than his wife and retired to bed, while she went to an opera with Mr. Duplessis. This continued for 2 months, and it seems that Lorenza finally ceded her virtue one night when her husband went to visit an apothecary. But having made Lorenza his mistress, Duplessis now wanted her to separate from her husband. She was won over to the extent of moving into apartments in the Rue Saint-Honore, Rue Street Honore, honor. Balsamo went mad with jealousy and rage, a reaction that throws doubt on the story of his deliberate complicity in his wife's seduction. He applied to the king for redress. It was granted, and in February 1773 Lorenza went into the women's jail of St. Pelagi, where she made the statement that has been quoted. She spent nearly a year in prison while her repentant husband tried to get her out. When she was released in December, his fortunes had taken a turn for the better. A skin lotion containing borax had made him money, and he had become instructor in alchemy to 2 amateurs of the subject. They decided to return to Italy, this time in style. Balsamo now called himself the Marchese Pellegrini, taking the name of the church near his wife's home. They visited Balsamo's family in Palermo, and he rented a house there for a time. Unfortunately, the goldsmith he had swindled was still alive, and had Balsamo imprisoned. W.R.H. Trowbridge asserted that Goethe's story of the Sicilian marquis, who effected Balsamo's release by jumping on the prosecuting attorney, belongs to this period rather than to his early Wanderjahre. In 1776, Balsamo returned to London and changed his name to Cagliostro, which happened to be the name of an uncle in Palermo. 2 important events took place on this second visit to England. He was admitted to the Lodge of Freemasons, and he was fleeced by confidence tricksters who thought he had a manuscript containing an infallible system for predicting the winning numbers in a lottery. The story is obscure, although it seems fairly well authenticated. Cagliostro may have predicted certain winning numbers through his power of second sight, but he did not want to continue doing it. There were lawsuits involving a necklace, and, as Carlyle puts it, quote, "The most accomplished swindler of the swindling 18th century was hobbled, duped, and despoiled by the aid of the masterly fictions of English law, end quote. It is impossible to know how far Cagliostro was to blame. Although more important from the point of view of his future was his admission to the Esperance Lodge of Freemasons at the rooms of the King's Head in Gerrard Street, Soho, on April 12, 1777. He called himself Joseph Cagliostro, colonel of the 3rd Regiment of Brandenburg, and his wife also became a Mason. What is this, the women's Masons? Is that the Daughters of the Eastern Star or something like that? How much more do we have in this chapter? Gee, many Christmas. Really? Okay, Jesus Christ. I may have to stop before we get to the end of it. We were... Okay. Apparently I've only read 10 pages. My God, it seems like twice that much. The Freemasons are a quote-unquote secret society of religious nature whose basic tenet is the brotherhood of man. Originally a society of stoneworkers who traveled around Europe wherever great buildings were being erected, with a system of secret signs for recognizing one another, it became the home of occultists, alchemists, astrologers, and so on. Readers of War and Peace will remember Peter Buzakov's encounter with the Freemasons when he is in a state of pessimism and exhaustion. Although Tolstoy was not himself a Mason, he states their aims with clarity and sympathy. First, the notion of brotherhood. No one can attain the truth by himself, only by laying stone on stone with the cooperation of all. By the millions of generations from our forefather Adam to our own times is that temple reared which is to be a worthy dwelling place of the great God. Sorry, and I forgot to say quote. That was a quote. So, starting with no one can attain the truth. This notion of a long secret tradition is of fundamental importance. Quote, the first and chief object of our order, the foundation on which it rests, and which no human power can destroy, is the preservation and handing on to posterity of a certain important mystery which has come down to us from the remotest ages, even from the first man, a mystery on which perhaps the fate of mankind depends. But since this mystery is of such a nature that nobody can know or use it unless he is prepared by long and diligent self-purification, not everyone can hope to attain it quickly. Hence we have a secondary aim, that of preparing our members as much as possible to reform their hearts, to purify and enlighten their minds by means handed on to us by tradition. End quote. He goes on to describe their third aim, the regeneration of mankind. This is the one that appeals most to Peter, when he details the 7 steps of Solomon's temple. There is a close connection between the idea of Masons and temples inevitably. Their discretion, obedience, morality, love of mankind, courage, generosity, love of death. Peter is rejoined to meditate continually on death, and he finds this the most difficult proposition to swallow. Tolstoy's description of the initiation rites should also be read by anyone who wants to understand the attraction of Freemasonry. To a non-Mason, these are bound to sound absurd. The aspirant wears a slipper on one foot and a boot on the other, and is led blindfolded through passages, led among certain carpets to the accompaniment of knockings with mallets and swords, made to hold a pair of compasses against his breast, confronted by men in robes pointing swords at him, made to kneel, quote-unquote, at the gates of the temple, and so on. At one point, Peter suddenly wonders if it is all a practical joke. Frank King, in his book Cagliostro, the Last of the Sorcerers, summarizes Cagliostro's initiation briefly. Quote, "The ceremony was very similar to that which is performed in Masonic lodges today, with the addition of several harmless but undignified scenes which were intended to impress the candidate. Thus Joseph was hauled up to the ceiling by a rope and allowed to dangle, signifying his helplessness without divine aid. He was stabbed with a dagger, the blade of which collapsed into its handle, to emphasize the fate which would be his should he betray the secrets of the order. He had to kneel, divested of his clothing, to show his subservience to the master of the lodge." End quote. It can be seen that the Freemasons are direct descendants of the Orphics and Pythagoreans. The aim of the initiation is to produce an immense sense of significance and reverence. It is not surprising that at the end of it all, Tolstoy's hero felt as if he, quote, felt as if he had returned from a long journey on which he had spent dozens of years, had become completely changed, and had quite left behind him his former habits and way of life, end quote. This also makes it clear why the Freemasons have always been persecuted, particularly in Catholic countries. The Church may feel that Protestantism and its various sects are bastard offshoots of the parent tree, weak imitations that can never be a real challenge because they cannot offer a real alternative to the immense apparatus of Catholicism. The Freemasons were virtually setting up an alternative church that claimed far greater antiquity than Catholicism. The man who joined it felt himself a member of the fundamental secret society guarding the most ancient mystery. The problem of an organized religion is always the same: how to imbue its followers with such a profound sense of purpose that old habits and personality patterns are permanently remolded. The Freemasons did this by using the techniques of the mysteries of ancient Greece. The initiate would emerge from all this with a sense of being in a neat and orderly universe, where his aims and purposes were suddenly quite definite. A tradition dating back to Adam stands behind him. The notion of the brotherhood of man gives him a new sense of belonging to the human race. What is more, the world is full of brother Masons, actively benevolent brothers who will not allow him to sink. This is, of course, an extremely important part of the attraction of any religion, for the craving for security and territory is deeper even than the religious instinct. At least it demands to be satisfied first in most people. The real power of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages lay in monasteries where the monks were given this basic security of tenure, so to speak. I have discussed Freemasonry at such length because it is impossible to explain the remainder of Cagliostro's life without it. Up to now he had remained an adventurer on much the same level as Casanova, an artist driven from pillar to post by adversity, by a fate that seemed to take pleasure in tormenting him and kicking his feet from under him. The wandering life produces a sense of pointlessness and contingency, a slow erosion of self-respect. Cagliostro was 34. He had been wandering for nearly 20 years. The life of adventure had lost its charm. This was like coming home. Its emotional effect was as profound as on Peter Buzakov. The transformation was total. He had been thrown a lifeline, and he lost no time in scrambling ashore. From then on, Freemasonry was his life's work. Moreover, since he himself was a born magician, was he not naturally one of the priests of this religion? His business was not to be a simple follower, like the valet and the aging alchemist who had been received into the London lodge at the same time as himself. He was a grand master by right. If he had joined the Catholic Church, he would have set out to become pope, feeling that was his natural position, and his fellow Catholics would have found his pushiness hard to tolerate. The Masons didn't mind it in the least. There would be no doubt about the genuineness of his conversion. He would obviously be a powerful proselytizer. Just as Italy was the original home of Catholicism, so England was the parent country of Freemasonry, for although it had not been its original home, it had been the source of a great revival of Freemasonry in the 16th century. And where was the original home of Freemasonry? Cagliostro knew the answer, almost certainly Egypt. What is the world's earliest great architectural monument? The pyramids. Is not the great pyramid of Cheops full of secret measurements embodying arcane secrets? Masons later built the Temple of Solomon, but that was long after, a whole 2 millennia later. Cheops was about 2900 BC. Solomon belonged to the 10th century. Cagliostro claimed that on his visit to London, he picked up at a bookstall a manuscript on the subject of Egyptian magic and masonry by one George Gaston. Whether this is true or not is unimportant. Cagliostro either discovered or invented the Egyptian rite, an even more ancient and solemn rite than that of the modern Masons. He devoted the remainder of his life to establishing the Egyptian rite. This was by no means an alternative to already established rites of Freemasonry. It was a higher order, and only Freemasons could qualify for it. As far as Freemasonry was concerned, the idea was a good one. A still higher order of adepts could only broaden their base and extend their influence. The founders of Egyptian Masonry were the prophets Elijah and Enoch. The latter was known as the Grand Copt or Coft. In due course, Cagliostro promoted himself from agent of the Grand Copt to the Grand Copt himself. He also added some impressive mystifications to his claims. The pupils of the prophets never die. Like Elijah, they are eventually transported bodily into heaven. They have 12 lives, and after each, rise up from their ashes like the phoenix. Cagliostro began to drop hints that he was thousands of years old. His wife, although she continued to look 20, even in her 30s, dropped hints about an officer's son serving in the army. There can be no doubt that Cagliostro continued to be something of a confidence man, but his claims were no longer personal. He saw Freemasonry as the supreme good for the world. It was his task to spread the word. The rites of Freemasonry are symbolic, like the Catholic Mass. Cagliostro's claims about the prophet Enoch and the phoenix were simply an extension of this symbolic truth. Their aim was to create a right frame of mind, to raise men above their old selves. The absurd miracles of the saints and martyrs are intended to have the same effect. How many pages did I say I had? Quite a few more. 311? No. 313? No. 3... Holy crap, 318. Okay, 18 pages to go. It's going to be another hour at least. Okay. What is more important, the psychological change that took place in Cagliostro and the new lack of self-division had the effect on his occult powers that we might expect? They increased suddenly. There are few stories about Balsamo's power of second sight or healing. There are dozens about Cagliostro's. He had a remarkable faculty of clairvoyance and was inclined to use young children as mediums. He would breathe upon the child's chin and forehead and then make mystic symbols on his forehead and hand. The 5-year-old son of Marshal von Medem was made to stare at his hand, and his father asked him what his sister was doing. The Countess von der Rack describes what happened in her memoirs. Quote, he described her as placing her hand on her heart as though in pain. A moment later he exclaimed, "Now she is kissing my brother who has just come home." End quote. On the Marshal declaring the marshal declaring this to be impossible, as this brother was leagues away, Cagliostro terminated the séance, and with an air of the greatest confidence ordered the doubting parent to verify the vision. This the marshal immediately proceeded to do, and learned that his son, whom he believed so far away, had unexpectedly returned home, and that shortly before her brother's arrival, his daughter had had an attack of palpitation of the heart. That's finally the end of the quote, sorry. Cagliostro now had a mission and a way of making a living. Now, when he entered a European city, he made for the Masonic Lodge, made speeches about the Egyptian rite, and initiated members into it. He seems to have gone to Venice, Berlin, Nuremberg, and Leipzig. In Leipzig, at a banquet given in his honor, he prophesied that if the lodge failed to adopt the Egyptian rite, its master would feel the weight of the hand of God before the end of the month. When the master, a man named Seifert, committed suicide not long afterwards, the Masons of Leipzig followed Cagliostro's advice. His tour of Europe became a triumphal procession from lodge to lodge as his reputation preceded him. Trowbridge, his warmest defender, admits that, quote, he did not hesitate to recruit his followers by imposture when without it he would have failed to attract them, end quote, but adds with undoubted accuracy that there is not a single authenticated instance in which he derived personal profit by imposture. The impostures seem to have been mostly in the matter of clairvoyance. The solemn Egyptian rite of initiation, which included long speeches in foreign languages by the Grand Copt, ended with a ceremony in which a young boy or girl, called pupiles or columns, practiced clairvoyance by gazing into a bowl of water. It appears that Cagliostro was not above bribing the pupile or column in advance. On one embarrassing occasion, after a highly successful séance, the column announced that it had all been fixed in advance, and Cagliostro had to brazen his way out of it. His stay in Courland seems to have been typical of what happened in most places. The head of the lodge, Marshal von Medem, and the marshal's eldest daughter, Countess van der Eck, were deeply impressed by the Grand Copt. His exhibition of clairvoyance through the 5-year-old son mentioned above was successful. So were seances where invisible angels kissed the child medium, the kisses all being clearly audible. At seances, Cagliostro also gave remarkable performances of thought reading. He possessed the same kind of power that Gilbert Murray later displayed. He correctly foretold that the Countess had recovered from an illness and would be found at a certain hour writing at her desk. However, the Countess was a mystic with Swedenborgian leanings, and all this spiritualism struck her as morbid. When Cagliostro, like Casanova, began to speak of how to recover buried treasure with the aid of spirits, her faith in him began to collapse, and he decided it was time to move on. The next stop was St. Petersburg, but here his luck ran out. It was here with his Colombe, suddenly betrayed him after a successful séance. His wife also, it seems, betrayed him with the Empress Catherine's lover, Potemkin, which pleased neither the magician nor the Empress. Her doctors, 2 Scotsmen named Rogerson and Mounsey, also prejudiced her mind against him. Licking his wounds, he moved on to Strasbourg. It was here that his fortunes took a steep turn for the better. He was already a rich man, and he entered Strasbourg on September 19, 1780, preceded by 6 liveried servants on black horses, and driving in his black japanned coach covered with magic symbols. Crowds lined the route. They had been waiting all day. He did not move to a luxury hotel, but to a small room over a tobacconist's in a poor quarter, where he proceeded to distribute alms and cure the sick. There can be no doubt whatever that charlatan or not, Cagliostro tried to live by the highest principles of Masonry, just as 10 years earlier in Aes he had given away his excess money to the poor, so now he set out to practice philanthropy on a grand scale. He had developed another typical characteristic. Perhaps because he was so often snubbed by the aristocracy as a charlatan, he was inclined to refuse to treat them or even to meet them if they came to his door. This is understandable. He felt he was working for the regeneration of mankind. He was an idealist. Why would he gratify the idle curiosity of self-opinionated aristocrats? When the philosopher Lavater, a friend of Goethe, asked to meet him, Cagliostro replied, quote, "If your science is greater than mine, you have no need of my acquaintance. If mine is the greater, I have no need of yours." End quote. Lavater persisted and later became the warmest of Cagliostro's defenders. And I am going to actually stop there because I can feel my voice going, and we're at a decent stopping point there. We've got about 16 pages to go for next time. If I wasn't stumbling so much, I'd have gotten through more of it, but boy, I take a break and kind of tend to lose my skill at reading out loud, I guess. So we'll finish up that chapter next time, which will be another about roughly an hour. And then we'll see how long this next chapter is, and it is 19. It's 30 pages long, so I don't know. We'll keep plugging away at this book. I'm really enjoying the book. I just can't read it for great lengths of time because my voice starts to go. So anyway, that'll be it for tonight. It's late enough. I'm not gonna try to game. So I will catch you all tomorrow night. Should be a Star Wars reading, barring some other thing coming up that makes me not be able to do it. So I will see you all then. Have a good night.
My heart is beating. I know the one is broken, one is beat because I have seen the fall. I have known somebody. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take. If you leave it behind, someone will break. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used to have no answers.